All right, hello everyone, and welcome back to episode 2 of my FiveM Zero to Hero Lua Development series. Today we're going to dive in and we are going to write our first resource in FiveM for FiveM. So a little bit of housekeeping and updates if you were following along from the first episode, which hopefully you were. I've just kind of cleaned things up and reorganized some things on my local machine, but effectively we're still running that vanilla FX server is how I'm going to be doing things. So one thing that I'm just going to do, just to clean things up, make things nice, is in my server data and then resources folder, I'm going to create a new folder called FiveM, and I'm just going to drop all of this other stuff in it just to clean it up and get it out of the way. Then I'm also going to create a new folder called tutorials for our tutorials, just so we have everything nice and neat. And now we're ready to dive in. For this episode, we're going to be following along pretty closely with the creating your first script in Lua documentation from FiveM, because it's a pretty great introduction on its own, and it's also nice to have something written down if you need to go back and look at something more closely or reference it. I want you to have a good place to do that. So this will kind of give you a visual walkthrough of this written tutorial from FiveM, and then in later episodes we'll branch out and start getting a little creative. So first, let's talk a little bit about what resources are. Some people call them scripts. I prefer to call them resources because oftentimes in my servers, a resource is a collection of a lot of scripts. You know, there'll be server-side scripts and client-side scripts, but essentially a resource is a collection of scripts that serve a common purpose. So for example, you might have a resource that handles fuel level in your vehicles, or you might have a resource that handles injuries and health levels. And oftentimes you'll have a server-side component that's maybe tracking that stuff and saving it to a database, and a client-side component that's, affecting the game world accordingly. So a resource is pretty much just a folder is where we start. So I'm going to create a folder for this. And since I mentioned in the last episode, the first thing we're going to do is make sure we're spawning in a little bit more reasonable area than out in the hills. So I'm going to call my resource ch_spawn. And it's totally up to you. I often like to prefix my resource names with something just because that helps me visually identify a resource that I made versus a resource that maybe I've pulled in that's open source or that I've purchased off the forums. And the first thing we need to do when creating a new resource is give it a manifest file. And you can think of a manifest file like a directory of sorts for FiveM. So it's going to tell FiveM that, hey, this is a resource, and these files are scripts that we should be running on the server. And these scripts, these other files are scripts that we're going to be running on the client. So we're going to go ahead and do that here. And manifest files in FiveM are titled fxmanifest.lua. And there's a couple keys and parameters we're going to give it here, and I'll kind of walk you through it as we go. So the first one we're going to do is fx version, and for us it's going to be cerulean. That basically just tells FiveM what version you are, and cerulean's the latest, so that's what we're going to use. Game tells it whether this is a resource for GTA 5 or Red Dead 2, or both. And in this case, we're just going to be making something for GTA 5. Now, one thing that's not listed in the documentation here that I'm going to do is I'm going to add Lua 5.4 yes. And that basically explicitly tells FiveM, hey, I want this resource to run under Lua 5.4, which has some nice newer features. So it's something that I always do with my resources. There's a couple optional things called out here in the tutorial, like author, description, and version. I typically don't use those when I'm building, private scripts for my own server. Because obviously I'm the author and I know what the resource does. But if this is something you were going to publish on GitHub or maybe sell on the forums, you would obviously want to include some information about yourself and what the resource is in the manifest file. Now, this next tag, resource type, is one that isn't used very frequently, but in this case, since we're writing a script that handles spawning and managing spawns and maps, we are going to want to set a resource type of game type, and then we'll give it a name of whatever you want. So I'm just going to call mine tutorial type. And now the last thing that we want to do in this manifest is tell FiveM which scripts to run on the client or on the server. And in this case, we're not going to have any server-side scripts for this resource right now. We're just going to have that single client script. So you can either do two things. If you only have one file, you can do this, right? Just client script and then the file name. If you have multiple files that you need to load at once, client scripts, and then you're going to give it a table of files like this. Now, I typically prefer, even if I've only got one file, just for consistency's sake, to use client scripts. It's totally your personal preference. So I'm going to use client scripts. And then another thing that I do is I always categorize my files into folders. So I create a folder for client files and a folder for server files. And it might seem a bit redundant to you to have a folder called client with a file called client. If you feel that way, totally don't bother using a folder. This is totally personal preference. It's going to be however you want to organize your resources to make sure that they're convenient for you to work with. So for me, I'm going to create a client folder and then a client.lua file in it. And in our client.lua file, anything that we write here is going to be executed on every FiveM client that connects to our server. All right, so now moving on to actually writing some code. And like I mentioned, we're going to follow along pretty closely with the existing written tutorial from FiveM. So let's grab this code that they've provided and let's kind of step through it. And ooh, that got a little bit bigger than I expected. Let's step through this and talk about what could potentially be happening. So the first thing we see is it's creating a local variable spawn position that's a vector3. Now, vector 3s are something you're going to find yourself using a lot in FiveM. And the most common representation of vector 3 is going to be a 3D point in space. So we have our X, Y, and Z coordinates here. And you're going to be using coordinates constantly to determine where a NPC is going to spawn or where a pickup is or maybe where a store is located. So we know that we've got a variable called spawn position with a point somewhere in the world. And now we see a big function here called add event handler. So if we break this out, we see the first parameter is a string of on-client game type start, and then the second parameter is a function. And so this is how add event handler, or these are how event handlers are laid out. So events can be sent from resource to resource locally, the client. So a client can trigger a event and any other resource can listen for that event on the client. You can also have client to server events and server to client events. So that's how you can get a client to send information to the server or have the server send information to a client. So in this case, our script is going to be listening for an event called onClientGameTypeStart, and then it's going to run everything in this function when we receive that event. So we've got three things happening here. It looks like all three of them we're calling a base FiveM resource called Spawn Manager. And the first one is set auto spawn callback, and then set auto spawn, which we're passing a true parameter, and then force respawn. Starting with this first one, set auto spawn callback, we could probably surmise what's happening here. There's a function that we're passing in. So this function probably gets called when we auto spawn or when we respawn. And we can see that in here, we're once again calling spawn manager and telling it to spawn the player. And we're passing in a table with X, Y, and Z coordinates, which are coming out of our vector 3. So that's a good thing to know about vector 3 is that vector 3s and vector 2s and vector 4s as well, is that you can access your X, Y, Z, and W points with you can treat it like a table essentially. And then we're also providing a model of AMM Skater 1. And then it looks like probably once spawn player runs, then it'll give us another callback here where we can run another function. And in this case, it looks like we're triggering an event. So in this case, we were receiving an event, right? We have an event handler in here. We're actually sending an event, and we're sending an event called chat add message. We can surmise pretty easily that we're sending a chat message, right? And then welcome to the party is probably what it's going to say. And yeah, then as we covered before, spawn manager, set auto spawn true, and force respawn. And I'm sure if we dive into stock resources, we can see, sure enough. Sure. So once again, FiveM documentation is really great. So we're looking at the set auto spawn function here, and it says that when it's enabled, players will automatically be spawned upon joining the server to a random spawn point. After dying, they will also be respawned for 2 seconds. You can also use force respawn to forcefully respawn the player. So that's perfect. Now, one thing here, which I'm going to call out, is when I'm following along with the tutorial, I don't like copying and pasting the code. Even though I'm going to wind up writing the exact same code, I feel that I understand the code better when I type it out for myself. And that's totally personal preference, but it's something I encourage you to try. And I'm going to do in this case. So instead of just copying and pasting that code, running it and seeing what happens, I'm going to type it all out. All right, and with all of my code written out, we are probably set to check this out. So I'm already connected to a FiveM server here, and it looks like it's dumped me in the control tower at Zancudo. So once again, this resource will be useful because then we can spawn somewhere a little bit more reliably. So following along with the tutorial, so next they're just going to cover how to run it. So the first thing we need to do, the first time we've created, if we've got our server running and we've created a new resource while the server is running, we're going to want to run the refresh command in our console. And that's just going to have FiveM scan for any new resources. And here you can see it found one new resource. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to drag my FiveM window over here so we can see it just a little bit while I'm over here in my code editor. And now I'm going to go ahead and start my resource. And if we have any luck, we will probably respawn, since the game type is going to start. We'll probably respawn wherever this is, which I happen to know it's Vinewood Bowl, but we're going to find out. And look at that. We spawned at Vinewood Bowl, and we also spawned as the Skater 1 model. So that's your first script, and it's running. And if we find ourselves in a situation where we are going to become fatally injured, which give me just one moment to set that up. All right, we are now falling through the air, and I have a feeling we're going to be fatally injured in just a moment. And look at that, we respawn, and you'll also notice that we've got those welcome to the CharlesHacks party chat messages that I put in as well. So this is your first script. We are all done, and now we have a resource that, respawns us somewhere a little bit sane, and we could change that location in the future. Maybe we want to respawn at the train station or near Pillbox, Legion Square, somewhere that's a little bit more convenient overall. But this is a great starting point, and obviously it's pretty immediately obvious that we're showing up where we are supposed to be. So that's going to wrap it up for this second tutorial, and I've got some homework for you. So if you want to take what you learned in this tutorial and expand it just a little bit further before you jump into tutorial number 3, here's your homework, is to go through the FiveM documentation and find out where it lists all of the different ped models and try changing this. And experiment with spawning different peds and see if maybe you can spawn yourself in as a cow or just another one of the different, dozens or hundreds of peds that are in the game. So that's a little bit of homework for you. And another one that you might want to try as well, this one's a little bit more simple, just change the chat message, have a little bit of fun with it, personalize it, make it your own. In the next episode, we are going to dive into spawning a car, which is going to be a lot more exciting, I promise. So you'll definitely want to come back for the third installment of this tutorial series. Anyways, that's going to wrap it up for this one, though. My name is CharlesHacks. Thank you so much for joining me on my Zero to Hero development series. And be sure to hit subscribe down below, turn on the bell so you get notified when the next episode comes out. Hit the like if you enjoyed it. Leave a comment down below with what you liked, disliked, and also don't forget to join the Discord server, which is linked down in the description. I've got a scripting help channel there. I try to be as responsive as possible. If you've got any questions, feel free to send them my way. The goal is to grow that community into, a great little community of developers who are helping each other and building each other up. So really looking forward to that, and looking forward to seeing you back for episode 3.